Hey guys, tonight we're heading straight into the frostbitten world of the Vikings, where snow hangs heavy on the pines, the fjords are glazed in silver ice, and survival isn't about your fancy tech or heated blanket. It's about whether you've managed to stash enough smoked fish and dried meat to not collapse halfway through January. You probably won't survive this, honestly, so let's be real about that. But don't worry, you don't have to, because you get to just sit back, stay warm, and imagine what it would be like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, though the Vikings didn't have YouTube, but they probably approve of you sharing a good story over the fire. By the way, let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you is the cold, a deep, bone-rattling chill that gnaws at your fingertips. You're standing on the edge of a frozen fjord, and the sun, what little there is, hangs weak and tired on the horizon. In this world, your survival isn't about tomorrow, or even next week. It's about tonight. Will the food hold out? Will the firewood last? Somewhere behind you, in a timber longhouse covered in snow, a Viking family is crouched around a central hearth, their shadows flickering against the walls. The smell of wood smoke lingers in the air, sharp and comforting, carrying hints of something simmering in a pot. It's not glamorous food, not feasts of golden turkey legs or dripping roasts the way the sagas sometimes exaggerate. It's more like a rough stew, maybe a piece of dried fish, softened in water, with whatever roots they managed to dig up before the soil froze, and that stew is everything. It's the line between living through the night and being just another skeleton dug up centuries later clutching a rusted axe. The Vikings knew this intimately, which is why their winters were all about preparation. Starting in late summer, they harvested whatever grains could be coaxed out of the short growing season. Barley and rye mostly, hardy enough to grow in poor soil and unpredictable weather. These grains would be ground into flour, baked into dense flatbreads, and stockpiled. Every loaf was an edible insurance policy, the medieval equivalent of your emergency canned beans in the pantry. Now historically, we know Vikings weren't just barbarians swinging axes and drinking themselves senseless. Archaeological digs of old settlements, like those in Jorvik, that's modern-day York in England, reveal cooking pits, charred seeds, and animal bones that show an actual diet far more balanced than the blood and meat-only image you sometimes hear. But here's a quirky little fringe detail. Some sagas and later folklore mention eating horse meat during rituals, which scandalised Christian writers when they recorded it. Imagine a missionary showing up and going, "Wait, you ate the horse?" And the Vikings shrugging, "Well, yeah, what else do you think we were going to do? Let it starve?" That said, scholars still debate just how much meat the average Viking ate compared to fish. Some point to coastal communities gorging on cod, herring and salmon, while inland families might have relied more heavily on dairy and porridge. It's a running academic argument that still doesn't have a neat resolution, partly because bones and seeds preserve differently in the soil. What we can say for sure is that no matter where they lived, winter demanded creative solutions. Drying, smoking, salting, burying food in pits. If you didn't think ahead, your household was in serious trouble by February. You crouch closer to the imaginary hearth, hearing the crackle of firewood, the creak of logs as frost presses down on the roof. There's a family huddled inside, their breath curling in the air. The father, a broad man in wool and fur, pulls a hunk of dried fish from a pouch. The mother crumbles a little flour into a pot, thickening it just enough so the children get something that feels like a meal. Outside, the wind howls. You can smell the brine of the sea even through the snow, reminding you that for Vikings the ocean was both pantry and danger zone. There's a certain poetry in that, don't you think? On the one hand, the ocean could flip your longship in an instant. On the other, it was stocked with protein that could be dried, salted and strung up in long rows, cod turned into stockfish, as hard as wood until you boiled it back into submission. The fact that you could gnaw on a piece of cod in January that was caught back in August is why you're alive right now in this imaginary scenario. But survival wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about morale. Picture the moment when a neighbour trudges through the snow, fur hood pulled tight, and ducks into the longhouse. Someone ladles out an extra portion of thin stew, and for a while there's laughter despite the cold. Food wasn't just calories, it was community glue. And honestly, if you're living in endless darkness with wolves howling out in the woods, that sense of togetherness is just as nourishing as whatever root vegetable made it into your bowl. Still, the Viking landscape could be brutal. The crops weren't guaranteed. A poor harvest meant the bread ran out early, and by February you might be chewing on bark bread. Yes, bread bulked out with actual tree bark to stretch the flour further. Archaeologists have found traces of this kind of survival food, and let me tell you, it's not something you'd voluntarily order off a menu, but it kept bellies from going completely empty. And this is where we pause right here, at the edge of the fjord, the hearth warm at your back, the storm clawing at the walls. You've just tasted your first Viking winter meal. Simple, smoky, salty, maybe even a little bland. But every bite is proof that you're still here, and every scrap of preparation that led to this moment is a tiny miracle of planning, resilience, and sheer stubbornness against the cold. You wake the next morning to the smell of bread, if you can call it that. Not the fluffy, yeasty kind you'd pull from an oven today, and golden crust crackling as you tear it apart. No, this is Viking bread. Flat, dense, and a little bit chewy, made mostly of barley or rye. Wheat was rare here in the far north, a luxury imported only if someone in the household had a few silver coins to spare. Most days you were eating barley, the workhorse of Viking agriculture. It grew even in rough soils, though it had a stubborn bitterness. To soften the edge, they sometimes mixed in rye or oats, grinding it all into coarse flour with stone querns. And those stones, by the way, left tiny gritty specks in the flour, so every bite of bread slowly sanded down your teeth over the years. Lovely, right? Nothing like a mouthful of bread that doubles as dental exfoliation. Still, bread was life. Archaeologists have dug up charred loaves from Viking sites, small and dark, sometimes baked in hearth embers, sometimes on flat stones. Imagine waking up in the longhouse and seeing someone press dough onto a hot rock near the fire, the smell rising with the smoke filling the space. It wasn't fluffy bakery romance, it was survival, pressed into every bite. Bread could be eaten fresh, dried until rock, hard to last through winter, or crumbled into stews to thicken them up. If you had honey, you could drizzle a little on top and suddenly it felt like a feast. The quirky twist here is that some sources hint at experimental grains and methods. In certain regions, bread was mixed with ground up tree bark or seeds when grain ran short, making it darker, heavier, and barely edible by our standards. Historians debate whether this was a last resort famine food or something regularly practiced in lean years. You can imagine the kids at the table rolling their eyes, ugh, bark bread again, while their parents tried to keep a straight face, knowing full well it was either that or nothing. Bread wasn't only daily sustenance, it was also symbolic. Breaking bread together in the longhouse sealed bonds of kinship and community. Offering bread to guests was a sign of hospitality. Some sagas even describe warriors being insulted if denied bread at a feast, as though being refused a slice was worse than being left out of a mead toast. You might laugh at the drama, but when grain meant survival, bread was more than food. It was respect, it was trust, it was an unspoken contract of survival in a cold land. And here's a fascinating scholarly debate. Was Viking bread leavened or not? Some argue they used wild yeasts, creating a sourdough-like tang that added flavour and a bit of rise. Others insist most loaves were flat, unleavened, and closer to crackers than fluffy bread. Without written recipes, we're left piecing together clues from archaeological finds and experimental archaeology. Yes, modern people actually grinding flour and baking it Viking style to test theories. The results vary. Some loaves end up as crunchy slabs that could double as shields, others with a pleasant tang that almost feels artisanal. As you chew through your morning bread in this imagined longhouse, you realise it's not just about taste, it's about the rhythm of life. Women, children and servants would have spent hours grinding grain by hand each day. The heavy stone quern required constant effort, and the rhythmic sound of grinding would have been the background music of Viking households. It's a strangely soothing thought. Stone on stone, grain turning to flour, survival being made one handful at a time. Bread also tied directly into the Viking economy. Barley wasn't only food, it was essential for brewing ale, their daily drink of choice. In a way, every field of grain doubled as both kitchen and brewery, so that as you bite into your smoky, chewy flatbread, you're tasting not only breakfast, but also the foundation of Viking trade, ritual, and even warfare. Armies can't march without calories, and raiders can't row across the North Sea without bread stuffed into their sea chests. Picture the bread storage for winter. Loaves dried until they were nearly petrified, Stacked on shelves or hung to keep away rodents, months later you'd dunk a piece in broth, softening it enough to chew. Think of it like Viking croutons, except instead of sprinkling them on a salad, you're relying on them to stop your stomach from twisting in hunger. A bit grim, but oddly comforting, because it meant one more day survived. The longhouse fills with morning chatter. Kids squabble over the last piece of bread. Someone gnaws on a slab too hard for their teeth, soaking it in a wooden bowl of ale to soften it. You sip along, noticing how the bread clings to the drink, how the grain fills your belly and dulls the ache of hunger. Outside, the frost glitters across the fields where the barley once grew. Everything is silent except for the distant call of crows. And so bread, humble and unassuming, becomes your anchor. It's not glorious, it won't win songs in the sagas, but without it none of those sagas would exist, because the heroes would have starved long before setting sail. Bread is the quiet, dependable heartbeat of Viking survival, and as you sit by the hearth with a belly just a little fuller, you start to understand why they clung so fiercely to every grain harvested under the brief northern sun. The bread sits heavy in your stomach, but you're not done yet, not when there's an ocean practically shouting at you through the icy wind. Fish was the Viking lifeline, especially through winters when fields lay frozen and animals were too precious to slaughter all at once. You walk down to the shore, boots crunching over ice-crusted stones, and see the boats pulled up, their hulls frosted white. Nets are coiled like sleeping snakes, and racks stand tall near the water, waiting to be filled with fish that would dangle in the cold air until they turned as hard as wood. Cod was the real treasure. Fat, protein-packed, and so abundant it almost felt like the sea was begging to be eaten. Vikings developed a genius preservation method: stockfish. You take fresh cod, split it open, and hang it up in the frigid wind for weeks. The Arctic air acts like a giant freezer and dehydrator combined, pulling out the moisture until you're left with something that looks more like a plank than food. Try biting it raw and you'll chip a tooth, but soak it in water or cook it in stew and suddenly you've got a meal that could last not just through winter but through a sea voyage across the Atlantic. The quirky detail here: in some sagas, fish was described almost dismissively, as if it was food for peasants rather than warriors. Meat was the prestige meal, but fish was the workhorse. Yet archaeologists have uncovered vast fishbone deposits at Viking sites, proving that, prestige or not, fish kept communities alive. There's even speculation that fish became a kind of Viking fast food, ready, portable, reliable. Imagine a warrior grabbing a chunk of dried cod the way you might snag a protein bar before hitting the gym. And not just cod, herring, salmon, trout, even seabirds and shellfish when available. Inland families might trek to rivers with spears or woven traps, pulling up fish that could be salted in barrels. Salt imported through trade was precious, so drying and smoking were the more common methods. Smokehouses filled villages with the thick, tangy smell of preservation, the air dense with a haze that clung to clothes and hair. Kids probably complained about it. Ugh, everything smells like fish again. But no one dared really complain when it meant survival. Scholars still debate just how central fish was to the Viking diet. Some argue the sheer volume of stockfish production in places like northern Norway suggests it was a dietary backbone. Others insist that in farming regions, dairy and grains may have outweighed fish consumption. It's one of those ongoing academic tussles. What percentage of calories came from sea versus land? We may never have exact numbers, but what's clear is that without fish, the Viking Age economy wouldn't have been the same. Stockfish was not just food, it was export. By the 11th century it woods churned across Europe, feeding markets far beyond the fjords. Picture yourself standing under a rack of drying cod. The fish swing gently in the winter wind, their hollow eyes staring out at the white horizon. The sound of ravens echoes above, waiting for scraps. You run your fingers along the rough surface of a dried fillet. Lightweight, almost like wood. It smells faintly salty, faintly sweet, and completely alien if you've never known hunger. But in a few months, when snow buries the fields and hunting yields nothing, that rack will look like a wall of gold. And then there's the sea itself, terrifying, merciless, and yet a pantry that never fully closed. Imagine rowing out on an icy morning, the waves slapping against the boat, your fingers stiff and raw as you grip the oars. A net gets hauled up, dripping, thrashing silver bodies flashing in the pale light. The relief you feel is almost sacred, because each fish is another day of life. Back on shore, you clean them quickly, gutting, splitting, stringing them up before frost can set in too deeply. The longhouse smells of fish stew at night, cod boiled with onions if you're lucky, or maybe just cod and water if you're not. The children blow on their bowls, steam rising into the rafters. Someone crumbles hard bread into the broth, and suddenly it feels hearty, satisfying. Maybe there's a little dill or mustard seed tucked away, traded from distant markets, transforming the stew into something more than survival food. And here's a fun, slightly strange fact. There's evidence Vikings even fermented fish in pits, similar to modern-day surströmming in Sweden. Yes, that infamously pungent, almost eye-watering delicacy that makes most outsiders gag. Imagine being trapped in a smoky longhouse in midwinter with their barrels of rotting fish bubbling in the corner. Delicious, or horrifying, depending on your tolerance. Scholars debate how widespread this practice was, but just knowing it existed adds a wild twist to our image of Viking dining. So as the night falls and you sit once more by the hearth, bowl of fish stew warming your hands, you realise just how much of Viking survival was tethered to the sea. Fish wasn't glamorous, and it didn't make it into the heroic songs, but without it, the sagas would have ended before they began. It's the silent hero of the diet, the silver thread woven through centuries of survival in the frozen north. By now you've chewed through bread that grinds your teeth down and gnawed on dried cod stiff enough to patch a leaky roof, but we both know Vikings weren't living entirely on carbs and fish flakes. Sometimes, when fortune smiled, or when desperation called, the table featured meat from the hunt. Picture a frosty morning deep in the woods, the crunch of snow underfoot, the creak of a bowstring pulled back, and the silent prayer that today dinner runs on 4 legs. Elk, reindeer, wild boar, even bears if you were daring enough. All of them made their way into Viking stew pots. Hunting wasn't just about food, it was status. A farmer with goats could keep his family alive, but a man who brought down a stag? That was bragging rights toasted over mead for weeks. Now here's the reality check. Hunting wasn't the main food supply. It was risky, unpredictable, and exhausting. You couldn't feed a whole community on the occasional deer, no matter how good the story sounded afterward, but it added protein, flavour, and most importantly, variety. You, sitting in that smoke-filled longhouse, would have celebrated the sudden appearance of roasted venison the way you might celebrate free pizza delivery after a long week. The taste of something different in the endless parade of barley and cod, that's enough to make spirits lift even in the bleakest winter. And speaking of spirits, literally, meat preservation was a whole ritual. You couldn't just hack into an elk and hope for the best. Most of the animal had to be carefully salted, dried, or smoked. Smokehouses weren't just for fish. Slabs of pork or venison hung from rafters, turning darker and richer by the day, smoke seeping into every fibre. Imagine opening the smokehouse door, warm air rushing out with the tang of hickory and oak, strips of meat swaying like crimson banners. That smell would have been intoxicating, promising survival with every whiff. Here's your quirky curveball. Some sagas mention eating bear meat, but with caution. Bears were powerful, near-mythic creatures, associated with berserkers and Odin himself. Consuming bear could be both feast and ritual, but it came with taboos. Some tales suggest eating bear liver was avoided. It could cause illness due to toxic levels of vitamin A, though Vikings probably didn't have the science for that, just the "my cousin died after eating that" warning system. Picture a group of hunters standing around a fresh kill debating, should we eat it? Maybe not the liver. Last time didn't end well. Scholars debate just how much of Viking meat consumption came from the hunt versus livestock. Some argue that wild game was more occasional, while domesticated animals, cows, pigs, goats, sheep, were the real backbone. Others believe certain regions with rich forests relied more heavily on hunting traditions. The truth is, it probably varied wildly depending on geography. Coastal farmers weren't going to chase elk through snowdrifts, but inland communities with dense forests, that venison stew might have been their winter highlight. Imagine the feast, a wild boar spit roasting over the fire, fat dripping onto the flames, sparks hissing upward into the smoke-blackened rafters. Children sneak closer, eyes wide, noses twitching. The crackle and pop of roasting meat fills the hall, and for one night the air feels lighter. The longhouse hums with voices, laughter echoing against the wooden beams. You bite into a slice of smoky, salty meat, juices dripping onto your fingers, and you forget, just for a moment, that tomorrow could bring hunger again. And here's a less glamorous truth. Nothing went to waste. Bones were boiled into broth until they cracked, releasing marrow. hides became clothing, sinew turned into bowstrings. Even the stomachs could be used as containers. It was a full circle kind of dining: eat the meat, wear the skin, craft tools from the bones. You didn't just survive off animals, you lived with them in every possible way. That's why hunting was both sustenance and ceremony. Every kill was honoured, because waste wasn't an option when snow buried the fields for half the year. So as you lean back by the hearth, belly warm with venison and bread, you start to realise that Viking dining wasn't about indulgence. It was about respect. Respect for the animals, respect for the hunters, respect for the fragile line between life and death. Every bite carried weight, every meal told a story. The wind howls outside, but for tonight, with the fire blazing and meat on your tongue, survival feels less like a struggle and more like a victory. The longhouse still hums with the smoky descent of the roasted meat, but there's another aroma mingling with it now, something creamier, tangier, softer on the senses: dairy. If fish and bread kept Vikings alive, dairy kept them going with a strange mix of comfort and practicality. Cows, goats and sheep weren't just walking larders of meat, they were long-term survival machines, producing milk that could be churned, soured, strained, or aged into food that lasted far longer than the liquid itself. You picture a Viking woman with sleeves rolled up, hands deep in a wooden churn, rhythmically pounding the cream until butter rises, the sound muffled by the thick walls of the hall. Butter wasn't just for spreading on bread, it was gold. You could smear it on flatbread, melt it into porridge, or add it to broth for much-needed fat during those lean months when calories meant everything. And here's the fun detail. Sometimes butter was stored in wooden barrels and even buried in bogs, where the acidic, oxygen-poor environment preserved it for years. Yes, bog butter. Imagine digging into the swamp and pulling out a block of fat that had been sitting there since last summer. Quirky? Absolutely. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. Then there was skyr, the Viking ancestor of modern Icelandic yogurt. Thick, sour, protein-packed, and easy to make by letting milk curdle and ferment with natural bacteria. It wasn't exactly your strawberry-flavoured grocery store variety, but it filled bellies and kept well in cool storage. Archaeologists debate how widely skyr was consumed outside of Iceland, but the evidence suggests it was at least familiar throughout the Norse world. Picture dipping a wooden spoon into a clay bowl, the skyr clinging stubbornly, tangy enough to make your lips pucker, but rich enough to silence your hunger. Cheese, too, played its role. Soft cheeses made quickly from fresh milk, hard cheeses aged for winter, curds pressed into moulds lined with herbs. Some finds even hint at flavoured cheeses, which sounds almost gourmet for a culture we often imagine gnawing on raw meat. Yet dairy wasn't just for meals, it was woven into rituals. Offering milk to household spirits, leaving butter out for protection, even using cream in medicinal concoctions. Food was never just calories, it was also a bridge between the living, the divine, and the unseen. The quirky, almost fringe detail. Some sagas describe milk as both nourishing and suspicious. In one tale, sour milk is offered to enemies, almost like an insult. In others, milk is considered a dangerous luxury if taken in excess, possibly because fresh milk spoils so quickly without refrigeration. Scholars debate whether Vikings were as lactose tolerant as their descendants are today. Genetic studies suggest tolerance was spreading, but not universal, which means some unlucky Viking probably spent a very uncomfortable night regretting that extra bowl of cream. Dairy work was relentless. Morning and evening, milking had to be done regardless of weather, regardless of raids, regardless of whether the cows were cooperative. The sound of streams of milk hitting wooden buckets would have been as common in a Viking village as the clatter of axes. Children might have been sent out to help, grumbling as their fingers froze against goat teats in the biting wind. Yet those same children knew that without milk the winter diet would be dangerously thin. Picture the family meal: flatbread smeared with butter, a slab of smoked fish on top, washed down with a cup of thin but warming ale. Then for dessert, if you were lucky, a bowl of skyr sweetened with a drizzle of honey. Imported, rare, and precious. The sweetness spreads across your tongue like sunlight breaking through the northern clouds, and for a moment, it feels almost indulgent. Even in a world obsessed with survival, Vikings understood the small luxuries of taste. Scholars still puzzle over how central dairy was to Viking diets. Was it the backbone in farming regions, or just a supplement when hunting and fishing fell short? The debate continues. fed by archaeological finds of butter pots, cheese mould, and residue analysis showing milk fats clinging to ancient cooking vessels. Every discovery adds another layer to the story, but the full picture is still blurry, half lost in smoke, half buried in bogs. As the fire burns lower in the hearth, you lean back, belly filled with bread, fish, meat, and now a dollop of skyr. You can almost hear the goats shuffling in the byre outside, their breath steaming in the cold. The cows, thick-furred and patient, wait for morning milking, carrying tomorrow's meal within them. And it dawns on you, Viking survival wasn't just about seizing the moment with a hunt or a raid. It was about tending, nurturing and waiting. Slow, steady care. The animals weren't just food, they were partners in survival, and every drop of milk, every pat of butter was another quiet victory over the winter's grip. The fire pops and hisses, casting sparks up into the rafters, and your belly is filled with enough fish, bread and skyr to quiet the ache of hunger. But here's the truth. Not every night in a Viking longhouse ended this way. For every evening where butter and venison hit the table, there were long stretches when the pot over the fire was little more than thin porridge, flavoured with desperation and maybe a pinch of dried herbs. Viking life swung between extremes, grand feasts that left people staggering and lean times when survival boiled down to gruel. You picture the longhouse on a feast night. Torches flare, smoke curls upward, the benches are crowded with warriors, farmers and their families. The chieftain raises a drinking horn, its rim catching the light, and a roasted boar sits at the centre of the table. Meat is carved and passed around, bread broken into generous hunks, butter melted across steaming dishes. Mead and ale flow, laughter roars, and the skald begins reciting sagas as the hall echoes with pride and bravado. For a moment, the longhouse feels invincible, defiant against the dark outside, but then imagine the same hall a few weeks later. Supplies are dwindling, the grand boar is long gone, the mead horn's empty. The family eats quietly now, the pot scraped bare after each meal. What little meat remains is salted away for emergencies. Bread grows thinner, stretched with bark or husks. Children ask for seconds that don't exist. The same benches where warriors once pounded fists now creak under silence, broken only by the slurp of porridge and the pop of the fire. The contrast between feast and famine wasn't rare. It was the rhythm of life. The quirky part, Vikings sometimes held what you could call status feasts. These weren't just about feeding the community, but about showing off. A chieftain who slaughtered more animals than necessary, who poured out barrels of ale like water, wasn't just generous. He was proving power, wealth, and divine favour. Guests feasted, but they also remembered. Your reputation as a leader could hinge on whether you threw a feast worth retelling. Yet the irony, all that over-the-top generosity might mean your household scraped the bottom of the barrel by February. Hospitality was a gamble. The scholars debate whether Viking society was truly egalitarian around the dinner table. Some argue food was shared relatively evenly, at least in farming families, while others point to archaeological evidence, suggesting the wealthy enjoyed more meat, more imported goods, and more exotic spices. Bones in elite graves sometimes show signs of richer diets, while common folk may have lived mostly on fish and grain. It's an unresolved question. Were feast nights moments of unity or reminders of who held power? As you sit in this imagined hall, the division is almost visible. The chieftain with his horn of mead, meat juices glistening on his fingers. The farmers at the edges, dipping bread into thin broth, grateful just to be included. Children watching wide-eyed, hoping sraps roll their way. The dogs underfoot, snapping up bones before they're picked clean. Feasts were community, yes, but they were also theatre. Every bite told a story about who you were, what you owned, and how long you could keep feeding the people who depended on you. The famine side, though, had its own quiet rituals. Picture women gathering the last dried peas from storage, mixing them into a watery stew. Men slicing bark into shavings to bulk out the bread. Children digging under the snow for forgotten roots, their fingers numb, cheeks red. Food became less about pleasure and more about ritual repetition. Grind, boil, stir, eat, sleep. The hunger gnawed, but life went on. And yet, somehow, these cycles forged resilience. Feasts gave Vikings something to remember during lean times, a story to cling to. Remember the night the hall roared with laughter. Remember the boar, the horn, the songs. Those memories were warmth against the cold. And famine, in turn made the next feast taste even sweeter, made every bite of roasted meat feel like a triumph carved against the harshness of nature. So, as you lean back in your place by the hearth, you can feel both sides pressing in, the indulgence of the feast still echoing in your senses, the sobering silence of famine lurking at the edges. The Vikings lived on that razor's edge, swinging between glory and scarcity, between overflowing platters and empty bowls. And every time they sat at the table, they knew it. This meal might be a feast, or it might be the last good one for weeks. Either way, they ate with intensity, because nothing was guaranteed once the snows came down. The hall has quieted, and the smell of smoke lingers, not just from the fire, but from everything around you, clothes, rafters, even the bread crust. That's because smoke wasn't just a byproduct of warmth. It was one of the Vikings' most trusted winter allies. Tonight, let's step away from the feasting bench and peek into the hidden systems that actually kept all that food edible through the brutal cold months. You've probably guessed by now. Without storage tricks, the Viking Age would have ended in a whimper of empty bellies. Imagine walking outside the longhouse into the icy dusk. Your breath clouds the air as you head toward a small half-buried hut near the edge of the settlement. Doesn't look like much, logs piled together, a roof weighed down with turf, smokestains marking the entrance, but this little structure is the reason the hall inside still smells of stew instead of despair. Inside are racks of smoked fish, slabs of meat darkened and shriveled, cheeses aging in the cool air. The smoke curls around you, sharp and biting, but also strangely comforting. Its preservation is progress. Drying was the simplest trick. Fish and meat could be split, laid out, and left to the cold air, transforming into something hard, light, and long-lasting. Smoking, though, added both flavour and insurance, since the chemicals in wood smoke deterred bacteria and bugs. Imagine standing by a smoking hut, eyes watering, watching the flames lick at wet logs. The food hanging above slowly shifts from pale to rich brown, carrying the tang of hickory, birch, or pine, depending on what wood you had handy. Here's a quirky little detail that scholars love. Vikings also used pits dug into the frozen ground to store food. Some pits were lined with stones or bark filled with meat or grain, and then sealed tight with turf. The earth itself acted as a refrigerator, but sometimes things didn't go as planned. Archaeologists have found storage pits where rodents got in or where the contents rotted into a foul mush. Imagine digging into your carefully hoarded supplies in February, only to gag on the stench of spoiled fish. Survival wasn't always neat. Salt played its part too, though it wasn't cheap. Imported from places like England or traded along the Baltic routes, salt was poured over meat and fish, pulling out moisture, creating something tough but edible for months. Think of it as a luxury insurance policy. If you had the wealth, you salted. If not, you relied on cold air and smoke. Scholars debate just how much salt preservation the average Viking household could afford. Some argue it was mostly for elites or for trade goods, while common folk leaned harder on drying and smoking. The truth probably varied wildly by region. Then there's the mystery of fermentation. Some evidence suggests the Vikings experimented with fermenting vegetables in pits or wooden barrels, creating tangy, sauerkraut-like foods that added variety and vitamins to their winter diet. Imagine the smell of a fermenting barrel tucked into a corner of the longhouse. A strange, sour tang mixing with wood smoke and fish. Not glamorous, but it kept scurvy away long before anyone knew what vitamin C was. Walk back into the hall now and you realise the fire itself was part of storage strategy. Hanging meat in the rafters meant constant smoke drifted up, coating it day after day. The rafters became black with soot, but also infused with years of preserved fat and protein. Children growing up in that environment probably couldn't remember a time when their hair didn't smell faintly of smoke and meat. The debate among scholars isn't just about methods, but about scale. Were these households stockpiling enough to last months without fresh hunting or fishing? Or were they constantly topping up supplies week by week? Some argue that large longhouses suggest communal storage with shared pits and smokehouses. Others think each family hoarded jealously, guarding their caches against neighbours when times grew lean. Survival can make people generous or selfish. So picture the February longhouse. The stew pot is thinner now, but still fed by something pulled from the smokehouse. Maybe a scrap of venison, maybe a hunk of fish softened in broth. The fact that it's edible at all is proof of foresight months earlier. Proof that someone thought ahead, salted, dried, dug pits, kept fires burning. And you realise as you dip your wooden spoon that survival wasn't only about bravery with a sword or skill with an oar. It was about patience, planning, and mastering the quiet, invisible art of storage. Every smoked rack, every buried pit, every sour barrel was a bet placed against the winter. Sometimes it paid off, sometimes it didn't. But without those bets, the Viking sagas would have ended in silence long before they reached the ears of poets. The smokehouse doors close behind you, and now the scent shifts. Instead of salted meat and charred wood, the air carries the yeasty tang of something bubbling quietly in a wooden vat. You follow it into the longhouse and find a few clay jars tucked in a corner near the hearth. Their surfaces sticky, their contents foaming with life. Welcome to one of the Vikings' favourite survival tools, ale and mead. Because when your water isn't always safe to drink, and the nights are endless, a little fermentation not only preserves but also soothes, and let's be honest, it takes the edge off when you're stuck indoors for 6 months of snow. Ale was the daily drink of choice, brewed from barley, the same grain that gave them bread. The process wasn't glamorous. Women, usually in charge of brewing, boiled grain mash, strained it, and let it ferment with wild yeasts. The result was cloudy, sour, low in alcohol by our modern standards, but nourishing. It carried calories, vitamins, and enough buzz to lighten the mood. Picture sipping from a wooden cup, the liquid warm from being stored by the fire, foamy and slightly bitter, with a hint of sweetness if honey or herbs were added. You'd drink it all day, from breakfast to bedtime, kids included. The alcohol content was low enough that even children could gulp it down without staggering. Then there was mead. Honey wine, golden and sweet, reserved more for celebrations. Honey was precious, gathered from wild hives or bought through trade, so mead wasn't an everyday indulgence. When it appeared, it meant something special was happening. A feast, a victory, a ritual. You can almost see the drinking horns being lifted high, their carved tips glinting in the firelight, foam spilling over the edges as warriors roared out songs. The sagas exaggerate, of course, painting mead halls as rivers of golden liquor. But even in smaller doses, mead symbolised joy, prosperity, and connection to the gods. Here's the quirky fringe fact. Some scholars argue Vikings brewed not only ale and mead, but also something closer to primitive beer, flavoured with herbs like juniper or yarrow. These plants added bitterness, preserved the brew longer, and gave it a sharp, almost medicinal edge. Imagine sipping a pint that tastes halfway between an IPA and cough syrup. It might not win craft beer awards today, but it did the trick back then. Experimental archaeologists have actually recreated some of these brews, and let's just say the results are an acquired taste. The debate among historians is whether alcohol was consumed purely as a necessity, safer than water, or whether it played a more central role in shaping Viking society and rituals. Some argue daily ale was just another calorie source, practical and unremarkable. Others point to sagas and ritual feasts, suggesting drinking was bound tightly to community identity, power displays, and even spirituality. The truth? Probably both. Ale filled your stomach on a Tuesday morning and mead lifted your soul on a feast day. Picture a winter night in the longhouse. Outside, the snow piles higher, sealing doors and windows. Inside, the hearth glows. And hands pass around horns filled with frothy ale. Laughter rises, cheeks flush, stories grow taller. For a while, hunger and cold are forgotten in the warmth of shared drink. Even the children giggle, lips sticky with foam, while the old warriors pound the table, insisting they once wrestled a bear with bare hands. The drink loosens tongues, and suddenly survival feels like celebration. But the dark side of this habit can't be ignored. Too much drink could mean wasted grain, food that might have been bread instead of ale. Some households probably balanced on that edge, choosing between hunger later or cheer now. Scholars still wonder, did alcohol sometimes worsen famines by draining resources, or did its preservation benefits justify the cost? The debate lingers, just as the yeasty smell lingers in the rafters of the longhouse. As you sip your imaginary Viking ale, that tastes gritty and sour on your tongue, you realise it's more than just a drink. It's a symbol of resilience, of creativity, of finding joy in the bleaker season. The ale doesn't just warm your belly, it ties you into the rhythm of a people who knew how to take grain, honey, herbs and thyme, and turn them into something that carried both life and laughter through the darkest nights. So when the fire burns low and the cup passes back into your hands, you drink deeply, understanding why the sagas always circle back to mead halls. It wasn't about the alcohol, it was about survival made beautiful, about turning necessity into ritual, about sharing warmth when the world outside was cold enough to freeze breath mid-air. The air in the longhouse is thick with smoke and the faint tang of ale, but if you step outside and crunch across the frost toward the edge of the forest, another side of Viking survival comes into view. Because no matter how many sheep you milked or how many fish you smoked, the real secret to outlasting the winter sometimes came from what you could scavenge from the land itself. Foraging wasn't just a summer pastime, it was a year-long insurance plan, carefully gathered and tucked away before the snow set in. Imagine walking beneath tall, snow-draped pines, the ground littered with fallen cones. In late summer and autumn, families would collect hazelnuts, walnuts and acorns, cracking them open to store the kernels in sacks or clay pots. Nuts were calorie bombs in a world where every bite counted, small enough to hoard in pockets, durable enough to last months. And if you've ever tried cracking open a hazelnut by hand, you know it's no small task. Now picture doing that thousands of times, day after day, until your fingers ached. Still, when February rolled around, those jars of nuts were worth their weight in silver. Then there were berries, lingonberries, bilberries, cloudberries, all those sharp little bursts of flavour that dotted the landscape in late summer. Families picked them in baskets, ate them fresh while they could, and preserved them by drying or mixing them with honey into pastes. Imagine tasting a spoonful of bright red berry mash in January, the tang cutting through weeks of bland porridge like sunlight piercing clouds. That sweetness wasn't just a treat, it was vitamins, protection against scurvy. Though no one knew the word for it back then, they only knew berries made you feel better. The quirky detail here. Archaeological digs have uncovered caches of seeds and pits from foraged plants that suggest Vikings weren't just gathering for survival. They may have been experimenting with cultivation, almost like proto-gardening. There's even fringe speculation that some households intentionally planted berry bushes near their homes, blurring the line between wild and farmed. Whether by accident or design, it shows the Vikings weren't just raiders or wooers, they were quiet innovators, coaxing food from wherever it could grow. Roots too played a vital role. Carrots, though smaller and paler than the orange giants we know today. Parsnips and turnips were dug up and stored in cool pits, lasting well into winter. Imagine the relief of tossing a few roots into a pot of stew, thickening it, turning thin broth into something that actually filled your stomach. Even the humblest turnip was a treasure when the larder looked bare. Scholars debate how much of Viking foraging was planned and systematic versus opportunistic. Were families carefully cataloguing which berries ripened when, or were they simply grabbing whatever nature offered? Some argue the Norse had detailed knowledge of seasonal cycles passed down like oral maps of the land. Others think it was more instinctual, survival driven by trial and error. After all, one wrong mushroom could end your saga pretty quickly, and mushrooms don't feature heavily in the archaeological record. Maybe they were avoided, or maybe they just left no trace. Picture a winter night in the longhouse. The stew pot bubbles with dried peas and a few scraps of smoked meat. A child drops in a handful of dried berries, and suddenly the stew turns crimson, the tartness brightening the flavour. On another night, someone cracks a nut and sprinkles pieces into the porridge, adding crunch, adding hope. Foraging wasn't glamorous, but it gave variety, and variety was survival for both body and spirit. And let's not forget herbs. Wild garlic, dill, mustard seeds, tiny leaves and seeds that could change the character of a dish. Imagine chewing on flatbread dusted with dried dill, or sipping broth laced with wild garlic. It was medicine as much as seasoning, proof that flavour wasn't forgotten, even when hunger pressed close. Quirky side fact? Some sagas mentioned strange herbs used in ritual brews, leading scholars to debate whether mild hallucinogens ever played a role in Viking feasts. Did the line between dinner and vision quest blur at times? We may never know, but the idea adds spice to the image of the mead hall. So as you return from the forest with a pouch of dried nuts and berries, the snow crunching beneath your boots, you realise the Viking survival strategy wasn't just about grand hunts or heroic feasts. It was about paying attention, watching the seasons, storing the small things, valuing the overlooked. Each berry dried in the sun, each root pulled from the dirt. Each nut cracked and tucked away was another piece of armour against the long, merciless winter. Back by the hearth, you toss a handful of nuts into your bowl, listening to the fire crackle, and you understand why survival for the Vikings wasn't just strength of arms. It was the quiet wisdom of knowing the forest, of remembering where the berries grew, of trusting that even the smallest things could keep you alive. The bowl of berry-streaked stew warms your hands, but the flavour hints at something more than the forest could provide. There's a sharpness on your tongue, a bite of salt, and maybe even a whisper of spice, something that didn't grow anywhere near this frozen fjord. That's the other layer of Viking survival: trade. For all their reputation as raiders, the Norse were also shrewd merchants, weaving networks that stretched from the Arctic Circle to Constantinople. And what they brought home wasn't just silver and silk, it was flavour. Salt was the first and most essential. Without it, preservation was always a gamble. You could dry and smoke until your lungs stung, but salted meat and fish lasted longer, tasted better, and travelled farther. Coastal communities might have boiled seawater down in large clay pans, scraping crystals from the brine, but that process was costly and labour-intensive. More often, salt came through trade bags hauled across Europe, exchanged for furs, amber, or even slatin. Imagine the satisfaction of sprinkling those sharp white grains into a stew, knowing each pinch represented days of rowing, bargaining, and maybe even fighting. Spices were rarer still, but when they appeared, they transformed meals into something almost magical. Archaeological finds at Viking trading hubs like Hedeby and Birka have uncovered traces of imported spices: coriander, mustard, even black pepper. Tiny seeds and fragments tucked into layers of soil, proof that somewhere, somehow, a Viking meal once carried a taste of the Middle East. Picture sitting by the fire in January, nibbling on flatbread flavoured with mustard seed. It's not just survival food anymore, it's an echo of distant lands, a whisper of exotic markets thousands of miles away. Here's the quirky twist. Sometimes these trade goods weren't just about flavour, they were about status. Offering a guest a dish spiced with pepper wasn't only feeding them, it was flexing wealth and connections. Spices were edible trophies. You couldn't hang them on your belt like a sword, but they told the same story. I've travelled, I've traded, I've seen more than you. Imagine the envy simmering in the hall when one household pulled out peppercorns while everyone else gnawed on plain porridge. But scholars argue over just how common these luxuries were. Some insist that spices were limited to elites, rare and fleeting in ordinary homes. Others believe the bustling trade centres meant even common folk might occasionally taste something imported, especially in coastal towns where ships arrived regularly. The truth, as usual, probably lay somewhere in between. Most nights were fish and barley. But once in a while, pepper on bread, salt in stew, maybe even cinnamon in ale, and suddenly winter didn't feel quite so endless. The longhouse grows louder in your imagination. Tonight's stew smells richer, spiced with something sharp enough to make your nose twitch. The chieftain passes his bowl down the line, murmuring about distant markets in Hedeby, where ships docked heavy with cloth, metal, and strange-smelling sacks of seeds. Children crowd closer, wide-eyed, not quite understanding trade routes, but knowing the stew tastes different, better. For a moment, everyone is lifted beyond the snowbound fjord. They're connected to worlds they'll never see. And this is the Viking paradox. They lived in some of the harshest landscapes in Europe, yet their tables, at least occasionally, were global. Salt from the Baltic, spices from the Silk Road, honey traded from neighbours, wine from the south. These weren't everyday staples, but they punctuated the monotony, transforming survival into celebration. Imagine the contrast. One night you're gnawing on bark bread dipped in watery broth. The next, a trader arrives with a pouch of pepper, and suddenly dinner feels like feasting with kings. It wasn't just nourishment, it was storytelling. Every spice was a reminder that the Viking world stretched far beyond the fjord, far beyond the snow. As the fire crackles and you breathe in the unfamiliar scent of spice stew, you realize the Vikings weren't just fighters or farmers, they were connectors. They bridged frozen forests and sun-soaked deserts, bringing pieces of the wider world back to their smoky halls. Each grain of salt, each mustard seed, was survival, yes, but also aspiration. Proof that even in the heart of winter, the world was bigger, richer, and stranger than the snow pressing against the door. The spiced stew still lingers on your tongue. But now the longhouse grows louder, warmer, brighter. Tonight isn't just another winter meal, it's a banquet. You shift closer to the fire as benches fill, horns are raised, and the entire hall transforms into something both practical and theatrical. Eating together in these vast wooden spaces wasn't just about filling bellies, it was about reinforcing bonds, declaring status, and weaving a community tight enough to face the brutal dark outside. Picture the longhouse, timber beams heavy with smoke, carved posts glinting in firelight, walls lined with shields. The hearth blazes down the centre, casting light across rows of wooden tables. Men and women sit shoulder to shoulder, children tucked in close, dogs prowling beneath the benches for scraps. At the far end sits the chieftain, his chair raised slightly higher, his bowl larger, his drinking horn more ornate. Food doesn't just nourish here, it radiates power. Whoever provides the feast controls the story. A servant places a roasted joint of meat before the chieftain, fat sizzling as it hits the platter. Bread is passed down the rows, butter, smeared across in thick slabs, bowls of fish stew steaming as they move hand to hand. The ale flows constantly, frothing and spilling, laughter chasing it around the room. The skald rises, voice carrying over the din, reciting a saga that praises ancestors and gently flatters the host. You can almost feel the heat, hear the crackle, smell the mix of meat, smoke and sweat that made these nights unforgettable. And here's the quirky detail. These meals weren't free-for-alls. They followed unspoken rules. Who sat where, who was served first, who got the choicest cuts, all of it was symbolic. The chieftain or host got the best meat, sometimes a whole leg or rib, and passed smaller pieces down the line. Guests of honour received special portions. If you were stuck near the smoky back corner with a bowl of plain porridge, well, you knew your rank in the social order. Feasting was a map of power written in bread and meat. Scholars still debate just how ritualised these banquets were. Some argue they were carefully orchestrated displays of generosity and hierarchy, almost like ceremonies. Others believe they could be chaotic affairs where ale loosened rules and people slipped from their assigned places. The sagas give both versions. Orderly halls where kings honoured guests with silver-banded horns, and drunken nights where warriors overturned tables in brawl. Which is closer to the truth? Likely both, depending on the host, the occasion, and how much mead had been poured. For you, sitting in this imagined longhouse, the sensory overload is the same either way. Dogs snarl under the benches, children giggle as they sneak scraps, men slap backs and shout toasts. The fire roars so hot you can feel the sweat on your brow, even as snow rattles against the door outside. A woman passes you a horn of ale, her bracelets jingling as she pours. You raise it high, foams diddling down your wrist, and join in the cheer. For one night, survival isn't just about eating, it's about belonging. And belonging was the true magic of these meals. The longhouse wasn't just a shelter, it was the heartbeat of the community. Feasts reaffirmed who mattered, who led, who followed. They tied families together, solidified alliances, and sometimes sparked rivalries. More than one saga begins with a feast gone wrong, a host slighting a guest, an insult thrown over a bowl of stew, and suddenly alliances shatter. In the Viking world, the politics of the table were as dangerous as the politics of the battlefield. Still, beneath all the posturing there was joy. Imagine the children wide-eyed at the sight of a whole roasted sheep carried in, or the old warriors grinning as they bit into smoked sausages, remembering feasts from their youth. Even the poorest farmer, when invited, felt lifted for a night into something larger than himself. The hall glowed, the food filled, the ale blurred the edges of worry. For a few hours, winter lost its teeth. As the night stretches on, songs rise louder, the scold's tales become more dramatic, and the fire dims into embers. You lean back, full to bursting, head heavy from ale, ears buzzing with laughter and music. Outside the wind howls, but you barely notice. Tonight you've glimpsed what kept the Vikings alive beyond calories. The feast, the ritual, the reminder that survival was sweeter when shared. The embers glow low, the songs fade, and you're left with the taste of roasted meat still clinging to your teeth. But as the longhouse empties, you notice something you might have missed in the noise of the feast. Not everyone ate the same way. Some bowls were filled with rich chunks of venison, while others held little more than thin porridge. And that's the quiet truth of Viking dining. Food was as much about status as it was about survival. Imagine sitting at the far end of the table, where the smoke stings your eyes and the scraps arrive late. Your bowl is filled with gruel, barley boiled down to mush, maybe thickened with a handful of peas. You eat it quickly, grateful for warmth, but your eyes keep drifting toward the chieftain's end of the hall, where the platters groan under roasted meats and bowls of imported spices. The difference isn't just about calories, it's about who you are where you sit. and what your role is in the social order. For the wealthy, food was theatre. A chieftain who wanted to impress a visiting ally might slaughter extra livestock, lay out salted fish, pour honeyed mead, even crack open a jar of imported pepper. Every extravagant dish said, "Look how powerful I am. Look how much I can afford to waste." And in a society where survival was always a gamble, the ability to waste food was one of the strongest signals of wealth. Imagine the awe, and maybe envy, of a farmer watching a lord feed his dogs roasted meat while the farmer's own children lived on porridge. Here's a quirky little detail. Some sagas describe warriors being insulted if they were offered only gruel or bread without meat at a feast. It was like being told you didn't matter, that you weren't worthy of the choicer cuts. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was language, an edible version of respect or insult. Pass someone the leg of a lamb and you honoured them. Hand them a bowl of thin porridge and you might start a blood feud. Scholars debate how stark these dietary differences really were. Some argue that while elites enjoyed imported goods and richer feasts, everyday meals across classes were more similar. Everyone ate bread, fish and dairy most of the time. Others insist the archaeological evidence shows a clear divide. Elites with higher bone protein signatures, commoners with signs of grain-heavy diets. The truth probably bent with geography and season. In lean winters, even the chieftain's table grew sparse. In bountiful summers, even a farmer might gnaw on venison. Picture yourself in a farming household instead of a chieftain's hall. Dinner is a simple stew, peas, onions, maybe a scrap of pork if one of the pigs was slaughtered in autumn. The bread is heavy, barley-based, spread with butter if you're lucky, plain if you're not. The ale is thin, brewed weak to stretch the grain further. You eat quickly, quietly, sitting near the fire. The meal more about fuel than celebration. Then imagine visiting the chieftain's hall the next night, where golden meat drips fat into the flames and songs rise louder than hunger. The contrast would feel like stepping into another world. Status wasn't only about food itself, but about how it was eaten. Drinking horns carved with silver bands, knives with decorated handles, wooden bowls polished smooth, all small markers of wealth. Imagine the humiliation of showing up with a rough, splintering spoon when the guest beside you used a gleaming horn. Even utensils told stories about your place in society, and yet no matter your rank, hunger levelled everyone in the end. The poor farmer's porridge filled his belly as surely as the chieftain's venison. In the darkest stretch of winter, when even elites ran low on salt and smoked meat, porridge became universal, a reminder that nature didn't care for stores. The sagas loved to brag about feasts, but archaeology whispers the quieter truth. Most people, most of the time, ate humbler fare. Still, sitting here by the fading fire, you realise food wasn't just survival fuel. It was power, performance, and politics. Every slice of meat, every spoonful of porridge told you where you stood. And if you were lucky enough to hold the choicest cut in your hand, you knew it wasn't just because you were hungry, it was because you mattered. The hall grows quiet again, and the ordinary rhythm of life creeps back in. No feasting, no bragging, just the steady grind of winter survival. But food wasn't only about filling bellies or flexing status, it was also medicine. In a world without pharmacies, where the line between life and death could be as thin as a splinter of bone in your stew, Vikings leaned heavily on the healing power of their food. And tonight, the longhouse smells less like feast and more like apothecary. Herbs drying over the fire, a pot of broth simmering low, its steam curling with promise. Picture a child curled up by the hearth, feverish and pale. The family doesn't have doctors, but they have grandmothers, women who carry memory like a library in their minds. Into the pot goes garlic, sharp, pungent, and believed to drive out sickness. Leeks follow, their oniony scent filling the air. Maybe a handful of herbs dried from summer, dill, angelica, or yarrow, are crushed and sprinkled into the broth. The liquid bubbles gently, the aroma rich and earthy. When the child sips, warmth spreads through their chest, a mixture of nourishment and hope. Garlic in particular fascinated the Vikings. Some sagas mention it directly, both as seasoning and as a healing agent. Modern science backs them up. Garlic does have antimicrobial properties. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder how much they knew intuitively about the medicine hidden in their fields. And here's a quirky little fact. One Old English medical text, written around Viking times, describes a garlic and onion remedy for eye infections that actually works against certain bacteria even today. Did Vikings stumble on similar brews? Probably. Herbs weren't the only healing foods. Honey, rare and precious, doubled as medicine. Smeared on wounds, it kept infections at bay, its sugars and enzymes killing off bacteria. Imagine dipping a carved wooden spoon into a jar of honey, golden and thick, and gently pressing it onto a cut. Sweetness became survival. Some even mixed honey with herbs, creating pastes or drinks meant to ease sore throats, coughs, or stomach pains. Scholars debate just how systematic Viking folk medicine really was. Some argue it was mostly superstition, ritual chants, offerings to spirits, and herbal guesses. Others point to the consistency of remedies across cultures as proof of real knowledge. The truth likely lived in the middle. Science hidden inside tradition, healing discovered through centuries of trial and error. Packaged in prayers to gods for extra insurance. Imagine being sick in a smoky longhouse. The healer leans over you, muttering a blessing to Odin or Freyja as she stirs a pot of broth heavy with garlic and herbs. She presses a cup into your hands, warm, bitter, soothing. You sip slowly, the liquid coating your throat, the garlic burning slightly but leaving behind a strange comfort. The chant continues, the fire crackles, and somewhere between the herbs and the hope, you start to believe you might see spring again. And it wasn't just about curing illness, it was about prevention. Fermented dairy like skyr or buttermilk kept stomachs strong. Dried berries warded off weakness in the long dark months. Strong broths made from bones gave strength to those who had none. Food blurred into medicine so seamlessly that it was hard to know where one ended and the other began. The quirky fringe detail? Some sagas hint at more mystical ingredients, animal blood or even parts of bears and wolves believed to pass on strength and ferocity. Imagine drinking a broth boiled with bear paw, convinced it would give you courage. Was it nutrition, ritual, or placebo? Scholars debate endlessly, unsure whether these tales reflect real practice or myth-making. But in a world where fear and hunger were constant companions, maybe a little ritual spice helped the medicine go down. So as you finish your bowl of garlicky broth in this imagined hall, you realise the Vikings weren't just warriors or raiders, they were survivalists with a practical streak. They turned their kitchens into pharmacies, their herbs into lifelines, their foods into cures. And whether or not the chants worked, the meals themselves gave warmth, strength, and the belief that even in the coldest winters, healing could still be found in the bottom of a wooden bowl. The broth is gone, the feverish child is sleeping, and the hall falls back into its usual winter rhythm. But what about the smallest members of Viking households, the children who had to survive on whatever scraps, bowls and mugs trickled down to them? Tonight you picture the longhouse through their eyes, the firelight lower, the bowls bigger, the benches taller, and food more a matter of patience than preference. Children didn't get first pick of the feast. They sat further down the benches, sometimes on the floor, sometimes sharing bowls with siblings. Their meals were often the simpler stuff, porridge made of barley, oats or peas, flatbread smeared with a touch of butter. Maybe a spoonful of thin stew if there was enough meat to stretch. Imagine a child chewing on hard bread so tough they had to dunk it in ale to soften it, their little hands wrapped tight around the bowl. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them alive. Milk was central to their diet. Goat's milk or cow's milk, sometimes fresh, sometimes soured into buttermilk, filled wooden cups and little bellies. Skyr, that tangy yogurt-like staple, offered protein and fat to growing children. Picture a toddler with skyr smeared across their cheeks, spoon clutched upside down, giggling while their mother shakes her head, knowing every bit wasted is precious. Milk was the closest thing they had to a safety net for childhood nutrition. Here's a quirky fact. Bones from Viking burial sites suggest many children were weaned later than in some other medieval cultures, sometimes as late as 3 or 4 years old. Breast milk extended survival when solid food supplies were uncertain. Some scholars argue this was a practical adaptation to food scarcity. Others debate whether long weaning reflected cultural norms about bonding, health, or ritual. Whatever the reason, it meant children had at least one steady source of nourishment in their earliest years. But even so, childhood was fragile. Archaeological evidence shows signs of malnutrition, lines on teeth, stunted bone growth, evidence of vitamin deficiencies. Winters hit hardest for the youngest. A bad harvest meant smaller portions, sometimes nothing more than watery gruel, night after night. Imagine a child staring at the pot as their mother stirs it thinner and thinner, hoping the little bit of grain stretches another week. The taste would be bland, repetitive, maybe even bitter. but it was still hope in a bowl. And yet kids found joy in the small things. Picture a child sneaking dried berries from a pouch, the tart sweetness exploding on their tongue like candy. Or a father cracking open a rare nut and handing it to his son as if it were treasure. Or on feast nights, when children were finally handed bits of roasted meat dripping with fat, their faces lighting up in pure greasy delight. Food became memory, something they'd carry into adulthood, remembering how rare and magical those moments felt. Scholars debate whether Viking children ate separately or alongside adults. Some sagas suggest the whole household gathered around the hearth, children included, while others hint at a hierarchy where kids waited until elders were fed. Likely it varied. In wealthy homes, hierarchy was strict. In poorer ones, everyone crowded around the same pot. Either way, children quickly learned their place at the table and their role in survival. The quirky fringe detail. Some folklore suggests giving children animal blood mixed with milk or porridge to strengthen them. Nutritious, yes, but also symbolic, tying them to the life force of livestock. Was this a real practice or later exaggeration? Scholars argue, but it fits with the Viking habit of wasting nothing and finding ritual meaning in everything they consumed. Picture the longhouse now. A child curls up by the fire, stomach full from porridge sweetened with a rare drizzle of honey. Another gnaws on a chunk of bread, too hard to chew but too precious to throw away. The dogs curl beside them, waiting for the scraps. The grown-ups murmur quietly, but for the children the meal is enough. It might not be plenty, it might not be glamorous, but it's survival. And in that moment, survival is everything. As you sit among them in your imagination, bowl in hand, you realize Viking children weren't separate from the struggles of survival. They were right in the middle of it. Their food shaped their bodies, their health and their memories. And every time they ate, they weren't just learning to fill their stomachs, they were learning the rhythm of Viking life. Feast, famine, patience, resilience. The children drift to sleep by the fire, their bellies full enough for one more night, and the longhouse grows quiet again. Yet outside the sagas, in the flickering stories told over mead, Vikings are often imagined differently, gnawing on raw meat, drinking blood from skulls, feasting like wolves under the moon. It's a brutal cinematic picture, but is it true, or is it just a legend sharpened over centuries of fear and exaggeration? Tonight we'll chew on those myths slowly, like a slab of dried fish you can't quite swallow. One of the oldest rumours is that Vikings drank blood, sometimes from slain enemies, sometimes from sacrificed animals. The image is horrifying and fits perfectly with the barbarian stereotype that Christian monks and chroniclers love to spread. But here's the quirky catch. While animal blood was used in Viking cooking, mixed into sausages, boiled into black puddings, there's little evidence they actually drank it raw. It was food, not ritual gore. Blood sausages were practical, packed with protein, easy to store, and waste-free. Imagine biting into a thick sausage on a winter night. The iron-rich tang coating your tongue. It's not barbarism, it's dinner. And then there's the raw meat myth. Some sagas paint warriors tearing into uncooked flesh, wolf-like, as if their rage made them too wild to wait for fire. Scholars debate whether this is metaphor, myth, or reality. Could some berserkers have gnawed raw meat as a show of ferocity, a performance of savagery? Possibly, but as a regular diet? Unlikely. Raw meat spoils fast, especially in summer, and the Vikings were practical above all else. Why risk sickness when smoke and salt offered safety? The more boring but truer image is a smoky stew, not a dripping carcass. Here's a quirky little fringe fact. In Icelandic tradition, there are references to sursudir hrutspunga, fermented ram's testicles. Yes, really. Preserved in whey and served at festivals, they were a delicacy of sorts. If your idea of delicacy includes wincing, did they count as raw? Not quite. Fermentation transformed them, preserving them like sour pickles. Still, it shows how myths about Viking food being gross often sprout from real, if unusual, traditions. The bigger debate among scholars is this. Were these bloody raw and extreme images Viking self-expression, or propaganda crafted by their enemies? Christian monks writing about raids had every reason to paint the Norse as demonic, blood-drinking pagans. At the same time, some sagas embraced the imagery, describing warriors as wolfish, ravenous, beast-like. Maybe Vikings leaned into the reputation on purpose. After all, what better way to terrify your enemies than to convince them you'd chew on their raw liver without blinking? its image as weapon. Picture the longhouse tonight with that myth in mind. Outside, a storm rages. Wolves howl in the distance. Inside, the family sits around the fire, bowls of stew steaming in their hands. A visitor from another land might step inside, see the smoke, smell the tang of blood sausage, and spin the story differently. They eat blood in the dark like demons. But if you stay, you see the truth. It's not gore, it's resourcefulness. Every scrap of an animal used, nothing wasted, even the blood. Practicality disguised as savagery in the eyes of outsiders, and yet imagine a feast where warriors wanted to shock their guests. A berserker tears into a hunk of half-cooked meat, eyes wild, beard dripping with grease and blood. Is it real hunger or theatre? Hard to say, but in a society where reputation was currency, sometimes putting on a monstrous performance was just as valuable as swinging an axe. So as you chew thoughtfully on your bowl of blood sausage, smoky and rich, you realise that myths of raw meat and blood drinking tell us less about daily life and more about identity, perception, and fear. The Vikings weren't vampires, they were survivors, but they were clever enough to let their enemies believe the worst. After all, if people already think you're a monster, why not play along? It makes the raid go smoother. The storm outside softens to a whisper, but inside the hall, the conversation drifts toward the sea, the other battlefield of Viking survival. You've sat through porridge nights and feasts, but what about the journeys between them? Because for every winter huddled by the fire, there was another season spent rowing across waves, chasing trade, plunder, or land. And out on the open water, survival boiled down to one question. What did you pack in the ship's chest to keep you alive when the coastline disappeared? The first thing pulled from storage. Dried fish, stockfish, stiff as wood, was the Vikings' perfect travel companion. Lightweight, long-lasting, and almost indestructible, though it could be eaten as is if you were desperate, or softened in water for a more forgiving chew. Imagine sailors cracking pieces of dried cod with their teeth, passing it around the benches of the longship as waves slapped against the hull. No one cheered for it, but everyone depended on it. Then came hard bread. Baked thin and dried until brittle, it was like edible stone. Some pieces survived for months, stacked neatly in sea chests, ready to be dunked into ale or broth. Scholars sometimes compare it to modern hardtack, though Viking versions might have been flavoured with seeds or herbs. Picture gnawing on one after days of rowing, the crunch echoing in your jaw, your body grateful for the grain even as your teeth curse you. Ale was packed too, though thinner and sourer than the celebratory brew back home. Fresh water stored in barrels often went stale quickly, growing foul with bacteria. Ale, with its slight alcohol content, stayed safer for longer, so sailors drank it daily, even when it tasted flat. Some sagas hint at ale souring badly mid-journey, leaving men grumbling and thirsty. Others suggest they thinned it out with seawater to stretch supplies, which sounds awful but kept them alive. Here's a quirky little fringe detail. Scholars think whey, the liquid left over from making cheese, was also carried on ships. Sour, tangy, and high in protein, it lasted longer than fresh milk and could be gulped down quickly. Imagine a rower lifting a leather flask, tipping back sour whey, grimacing, then passing it to the next man. Not exactly glamorous, but it filled the gap when ale ran short. Debates still rage about how Vikings managed to eat fresh food on long voyages. Some historians argue they carried livestock aboard, chickens, goats, maybe even small cows, providing milk, eggs, or occasional fresh meat. Others insist the cramped, salt-sprayed longships left little room for animals, making dried goods the main staple. A few sagas describe animals on board, but it's hard to tell whether these were routine practices or rare luxuries for longer journeys. Picture a day at sea. The sun glints harsh on the water, the wind cuts cold, and your arms ache from rowing. A break is called, and the crew digs into sea chests. Out come the dried fish, the hard bread, the thin ale, maybe a pouch of dried berries passed down the line, a rare burst of sweetness against the salt of the ocean. Someone chews too fast and cracks a tooth. Another dunks their bread in ale to soften it, grinning as it dissolves into mush. It's not a feast, but it's fuel, and that's all anyone cares about when land is still a week away. The open question, of course, is how they endured voyages that stretched for months, across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, even from Vinland. Some argue the combination of stockfish, hard bread, ale, and occasional catches of fresh fish from the sea was enough. Others believe they must have had more creative solutions: fermented foods, dried fruits, maybe even portable barrels of sauerkraut-like vegetables. Archaeological evidence is slim, so we're left with educated guesses and experiments by modern reenactors who try to live on Viking rations at sea. The reviews? Monotonous but survivable. Night falls on the longship, the men curl up under cloaks, the food stowed away again, the barrels lashed tight against the rocking deck. The ocean groans, the stars blaze, and the only comfort is knowing that tomorrow, when hunger gnaws, the dried fish and hard bread will still be there. Out here, survival is stripped bare. No feasts, no sagas, just the rhythm of rowing and the stubborn determination to keep chewing, no matter how hard the food or the voyage. The sea fades from your imagination, and now you're back inland, where winter survival was decided long before the first snow fell. Autumn was the season of slaughter, when Viking households faced the blunt math of livestock management. Too many mouths to feed meant too little grain to last until spring. So with days growing shorter and frost creeping into the fields, families turned to butchering. It wasn't cruelty, it was calculus. Picture the farmyard in late October. The air is sharp, smelling of wood smoke and damp soil. Animals shuffle nervously in the pens. Cows, pigs, goats, sheep. They were not pets. Their survival wrapped in fur and fleece. The strongest breeders are spared, kept alive on hay and whatever scraps can be spared. The weaker, extra, or unlucky are led away. Knives flash, blood steams in the cold air, and the yard fills with the harsh sounds of slaughter. It's grim, but every cut is measured, every drop destined for use. Meat was carved into slabs, salted, smoked, or dried. Fat was rendered into tallow for cooking or candles. Bones were cracked for marrow or boiled for broth. Even the intestines became casings for sausages. Nothing was wasted. Waste meant hunger later. Imagine racks of pork ribs hanging in the smokehouse. Goat legs strung high to keep away dogs, sausages coiled like ropes drying above the fire. The whole village smelled of meat, smoke, and inevitability. Here's the quirky little detail. The blood from slaughter wasn't discarded. It was caught in bowls, stirred to keep it from clotting, and poured into cooking pots. Mixed with barley or flour, it became blood bread or blood porridge, dense and iron-rich. It might sound gruesome, but it was efficient nutrition. Imagine sipping a steaming bowl of blood-thickened gruel on a freezing November morning. Dark, metallic, but filling. For Vikings, this wasn't shocking, it was just smart. Scholars debate whether the autumn slaughter was a practical routine or also a ritual. Some evidence suggests sacrifices to the gods coincided with butchering, offerings of blood and meat to Odin, Freya, or local spirits. Was the line between survival and religion blurred? Almost certainly. Killing an animal wasn't just about food, it was a moment to acknowledge life, death, and the thin balance between them. Some argue that the great seasonal feasts described in sagas were tied directly to slaughter season, when fresh meat was suddenly abundant. Others think ritual sacrifices were rarer, reserved for elites or special occasions. Imagine the mood in the longhouse after slaughter. For a brief window, meals were rich, heavy, joyous, fresh pork roasted on spits, steam rising into the rafters. Children bit into sausages hot from the pan. Adults savoured fat crackling on their tongues. It was a fleeting abundance, a reward for the work, and a buffer for the lean months to come. But everyone knew it wouldn't last. Within weeks, the fresh meat was gone, and only the preserved cuts remained, waiting in pits and smokehouses. And slaughter season wasn't just about meat. It also marked the rhythm of work. Hides were scraped for clothing and boots. Horns and bones were set aside for tools. Tallow candles were poured for the dark months. The entire household moved in sync, each task ensuring that the winter would be survivable if not comfortable. Picture a line of people working in silence, hands red, breath steaming, fire crackling in the background. It wasn't gruesome, it was routine, as essential as harvesting grain or mending nets. The debate among scholars today lingers on just how many animals a typical household could support through winter. Some argue most families kept only a few cows, a handful of goats or sheep, and perhaps a pig or two. Others think wealthier farms might have supported larger herds, with the slaughter yielding huge stores of meat. The archaeological record is uneven, leaving room for speculation. What's clear is that every family, rich or poor, faced the same choice: feed the animals through winter, or feed themselves by ending their animals' lives. As you sit by the fire, you can almost taste the richness of fresh autumn pork, the rare sweetness of abundance. But you also feel the shadow of scarcity lurking behind it. Slaughter was never just about indulgence. It was about discipline, about making sure the family had enough to chew on when February howled at the door, and so each slice, each sausage, each steaming pot of broth was a careful promise to the future. The season of slaughter lingers in your senses, the smoke, the fat, the iron tang of blood, but once the fresh cuts were gone, it was the quieter craft of dairy making that stretched survival through the long months. If meat was drama, dairy was patience. Day after day, cows and goats gave their steady trickle of milk, and clever hands turned it into foods that could outlast the snow. Tonight the longhouse feels different, less like a battlefield of blood, more like a workshop of curds and whey. Picture a Viking woman straining warm milk through coarse cloth, steam curling into the rafters. The liquid drips away, leaving behind thick clumps of curds. She presses them into wooden moulds, the patterns carving themselves into tomorrow's cheese. On another bench, butter churns thud rhythmically, cream sloshing until it breaks, golden lumps forming under tired hands. It's not glamorous work, but it's survival magic, the ability to turn something fleeting into something lasting. Cheese was a staple, and not just one kind. Fresh, soft cheeses, quick to make, were eaten within days. Harder cheeses, pressed and salted, could last weeks or months. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia even show impressions of cheese moulds and residues of milk fat clinging to clay pots. Imagine lifting the lid off a cool cellar jar to reveal a wheel of cheese, aged just enough to be sharp, the smell earthy and sour. It's a taste of security. Then there was skyr, still eaten in Iceland today. Thick, tangy, high in protein, it was created by letting milk ferment with natural bacteria, straining it until it resembled a dense yogurt. You can almost feel the spoon scraping the clay bowl, the sourness puckering your tongue, the richness soothing your stomach. For children it was filling and safe. For adults, it was fuel that kept muscles strong for chopping wood or mending nets. The quirky detail. Dairy didn't just sit in jars. It sometimes ended up in bogs. Just as butter was buried in marshy ground for preservation, some evidence suggests that surplus dairy was hidden away in wetlands, where the cold, oxygen-poor environment kept it edible for months, even years. Imagine digging into a swamp in February and pulling out a barrel of butter, preserved like a time capsule. It sounds bizarre, but bog butter is a very real thing archaeologists still dig up today, sometimes still faintly edible after 1,000 years. Scholars debate how central dairy was compared to meat and fish. Some argue it was a major calorie source for inland farmers, who couldn't rely as heavily on the sea. Others suggest dairy was more supplemental, since herds were small and milk yields modest. Genetic studies add another wrinkle. Not all Vikings may have been fully lactose tolerant, meaning some might have relied more on fermented dairy like skyr or whey, which are easier to digest. It's a puzzle pieced together from bones, pottery, and the occasional bog barrel. Picture the longhouse in for January. A family gathers around the hearth. A loaf of barley bread is broken, butter spread thick across it. A bowl of skyr is passed, sweetened with a drizzle of honey saved for special nights. The air smells faintly of curds drying on racks, of milk steaming in pots. It's a quieter meal than the dramatic feasts of autumn, but one that carries reassurance. As long as the goats keep giving, there will be food. Dairy also had symbolic weight. Butter was sometimes offered to spirits of the home, smeared on doorposts or left in bowls as gifts. Milk, with its nourishing purity, was tied to fertility, growth, and continuity. Feeding children skyr wasn't just about nutrition. It was a way of passing down strength, of saying, "Sir, you will outlast the winter too." The fringe detail? Some sagas suggest milk could be used in curses or magic, its whiteness linked to purity but also vulnerability. A spilled bucket might be more than an accident. It could be an omen. Had Vikings truly believed their milk had mystical power, or is this just saga drama? Scholars argue. But the fact that dairy appears in both kitchens and stories tells you it mattered deeply. So as you scrape the last of the skyr from your wooden bowl, tangy and fillings, you realise dairy making wasn't just a side chore. It was the steady heartbeat of Viking survival, a daily rhythm that turned the uncertain flow of milk into something solid, durable and sustaining. In the roar of the feast, dairy might be overlooked, but in the silence of midwinter, it was often what kept bellies full. The taste of skyr lingers on your tongue, sharp and sour, but tonight the longhouse air carries another aroma entirely, something tangy, almost biting, a smell that makes you wrinkle your nose before curiosity takes over. Welcome to the Viking art of fermentation, where food didn't just sit around waiting to rot, it transformed into something new, something strangely magical. If dairy was patient craft, fermentation was alchemy, the quiet, bubbling science of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Picture a row of wooden barrels tucked into a cool corner of the hall. Inside, vegetables are submerged under brine, slowly softening, tangy flavours blooming day by day. No one in the longhouse knows the words lactic acid bacteria, but they know the taste, and they know it keeps them strong through winter. Imagine scooping out a handful of sour cabbage, crisp and biting, a Viking cousin to sauerkraut. The crunch cuts through the monotony of porridge, and the sourness wakes you up in the middle of a dark February. Fermentation wasn't just for vegetables. Grains, too, were steeped, boiled, and left to bubble into ale, the yeasts working their quiet magic. Dairy became buttermilk and skyr, transformed from milk that would otherwise sour too quickly. Even fish could be fermented, buried in pits, left to cure in its own brine, then dug up weeks later. Yes, it stank. Yes, it probably cleared the sinuses of everyone in a 5-metre radius. But it was food, and in winter, that was reason enough. Here's the quirky fringe fact. One Icelandic tradition involves fermented shark, known today as hakal. Though most evidence for it comes later, some scholars wonder if its roots stretch back to Viking times. Imagine a block of shark meat buried under gravel, fermenting in the cold earth for months before being hung to dry. The smell? Ammonia, like chewing on cleaning fluid. The taste? Apparently unforgettable. Was it eaten out of necessity or bravado? Hard to say, but it proves that Viking palates weren't squeamish when it came to preserving calories. The debate among historians is whether fermentation was widespread or more regional. In coastal areas, fermenting fish and seabirds may have been common. Inland, the focus was more on fermented dairy and ale. Some argue that vegetables were less central, given the short growing seasons, while others point to archaeological finds of seeds and plant residues that suggest sauerkraut-like dishes could have been common. The evidence is fragmentary, leaving us to imagine a patchwork of traditions across the Norse world. Picture a winter meal brightened by these oddities. The pot over the fire simmers with barley porridge. Into it goes scraps of smoked meat, but also a spoonful of fermented cabbage, lending a tang that cuts the heaviness. On the side, a cup of sour ale is passed around, frothy and sharp. The children sip buttermilk, wrinkling their noses at the sourness but gulping it down anyway. The dogs circle, whining as someone opens a barrel of fermented fish, the smell filling the hall until even the smoke seems sweet in comparison. It's not glamorous, but it's nourishment that lasts. And here's another curious twist. Fermentation doubled as medicine. Sour whey was thought to calm stomachs. Fermented herbs were believed to ward off illness. Even the strong tang of fermented vegetables carried an air of vitality, proof that the food still held life within it. Imagine a mother pressing a cup of sour whey into her child's hands, insisting it would make them strong. Whether it worked or not, the ritual itself gave comfort. But fermentation wasn't only about health, it was also about resilience. When you ferment, you admit defeat against freshness, but claim victory over time. You transform decay into survival. Vikings, without knowing the microbiology, mastered this balance. They harnessed invisible forces, turning food that would spoil into food that endured. And in doing so, they carved out a little more certainty against the chaos of winter. So, as you sit by the fire with a bowl of sour, tangy cabbage mixed into your stew, you breathe in the strange and pungent scent and realize fermentation was the Viking way of negotiating with nature. It was half practicality, half magic, a gamble that paid off most of the time, enough to keep families alive until spring. And even if the taste was sharp, even if the smell was unforgettable, it was proof of a deeper truth. Survival wasn't always pretty, but it was always inventive. The sharp tang of fermented cabbage fades into the smoky air. But now another layer settles over the longhouse. Ritual. Food for the Vikings. Wasn't only about feeding stomachs. It fed the gods, the ancestors, and the spirits who shared their world. Tonight, the hall feels more like a temple than a dining room. The crackle of the fire mingling with chants and the heavy aroma of roasted meat prepared not just for people, but for powers unseen. Picture a midwinter blot, a sacrificial feast held when the nights were longest and the hunger sharpest. A boar is led into the hall, its bristles glinting in the firelight, its breath steaming in the cold. With solemn ceremony it's slaughtered, its blood caught in a bowl and sprinkled across idols of Odin, Thor, or Freya. The meat is roasted and shared among the people, but always with the knowledge that it was first an offering. Each bite carries both survival and reverence, the flavours mingled with the weight of divine favour. Here's the quirky detail. One particular tradition, the sonagolta, or sacrifice boar, involved placing hands on the animal's bristles and swearing oaths before it was killed. Imagine men pledging loyalty, vengeance, or glory, their palms pressed against a living boar while the smell of roasting fat already lingers in the air. The feast wasn't just about food, it was about promises sealed with blood and appetite. Scholars debate how widespread such rituals were. Some argue sacrificial feasts were central to Norse religion, tying the community together through shared offerings. Others suggest the dramatic accounts were exaggerated, recorded by later Christian writers eager to paint pagan practices as grotesque. Archaeological evidence does show animal bones in ritual pits, some burned, some split for marrow, hinting at meals that doubled as sacrifices. But how common were they in everyday farms versus large cult centres? The answer is still cloudy, leaving us with fragments and sagas. Imagine the longhouse filled for such a night. The idols stand near the high seat smeared with blood gleaming in the firelight. The chieftain raises a horn dedicating the feast to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for strength, to Freya for fertility. Platters of meat are passed out, bowls of broth steaming, horns of mead lifted high. The people eat not just for themselves, but for the gods, each mouthful a prayer disguised as a meal. Children sit wide-eyed, sensing the gravity, chewing their portions slowly, as if swallowing faith itself. And it wasn't only the major gods. Household spirits, the Landvatir, the Dizir, the ancestors were fed too. A bowl of milk might be left by the hearth. A hunk of bread placed outside the door, a splash of ale poured on the ground. These small offerings blurred the line between meal and ritual. Imagine a farmer carefully setting aside the best bit of butter before spreading the rest on his bread, placing it on a shelf for the unseen to taste. Was it superstition, or just another way of acknowledging the fragility of life, hoping goodwill might tip the scales? The fringe detail. Some sagas describe human sacrifice in connection with food rituals, slaves or captives killed alongside animals, their blood offered with the feast. Scholars argue fiercely about whether this was a reality or exaggeration. Some evidence at sites like Uppsala suggests human bones among sacrificial remains, but whether these were common practices or rare extremes is still hotly debated. The image of a feast turning from communal meal to grim spectacle is chilling, but it underscores how tightly food, death, and belief intertwined. Picture yourself at such a ritual. You lift a slice of roasted pork to your lips, the fat sizzling on your fingers. Around you, horns clash, songs rise, prayers are murmured. Every taste is more than calories, it's covenant. You don't just eat to survive, you eat to bind yourself to God's family and fate. Even the act of chewing feels heavier, as though you're swallowing the promises of your people. So as the embers fade, and the last scraps of meat are licked from bones, you realise Viking meals weren't only about survival strategies. Sometimes they were holy, a way of weaving the divine into the everyday, of ensuring that the gods, too, shared the struggle of winter. Every bite was both fuel and faith, a way of saying, we eat, we live, but not alone. The ritual feast ends, the gods are fed, and the hall slowly empties. But not every Viking meal was about barley bread, smoked fish, or pork stew. Sometimes survival, and even celebration, meant leaning into foods that sound downright strange to modern appetites. Tonight the longhouse smells less like comfort and more like curiosity, because on the table sit some of the quirkier delicacies that kept the Norse going through the freeze. First up, sheep's head. Known later in Iceland as svidi, it was boiled or singed until the wool burned away, then roasted or stewed. The whole head, eyes, cheeks, tongue, was eaten, nothing wasted. Imagine sitting by the fire with a sheep's skull in your lap, peeling meat from its face, slurping marrow from the jaw. It sounds grisly. But to Vikings it was practical, even honourable. Every part of the animal that gave wool and milk was used, right down to the head on the plate. Then there were seabirds. Gulls, puffins and guillemots were trapped along cliffs, their eggs snatched from rocky nests. On remote islands, people developed methods for cooking or salting seabirds' meat, turning sharp, oily flesh into winter food. Picture a puffin hanging in a smokehouse, its tiny wings stretched like flags. the smell pungent enough to cling to your clothes. Was it delicious? Probably not. But in January, flavour mattered less than calories. And here's a particularly quirky detail. Fish livers. Cod liver oil, rich in fat and vitamins, was likely consumed long before it became a bottled health supplement. Livers could be boiled down, the oil skimmed and stored, precious source of energy in a diet heavy on lean protein. Imagine swallowing a spoonful of steaming fish oil on a cold morning, slippery bitter, but warming all the way down. Not exactly a treat, but a Viking multivitamin. The debate among scholars is whether these foods were seen as normal staples or as fallback desperation meals. Were sheep's heads served proudly at feasts, or quietly boiled when no better cuts remained? Was puffin a delicacy of island life, or a symbol of poverty? The sagas are frustratingly vague, focusing on mead hall feasts rather than cliffside suppers. Archaeological evidence shows seabird bones in Viking middens, but whether they were prized or tolerated is still up for grabs. Picture the hall on one of these nights. A pot of sheep's head stew bubbles over the fire, the cheeks soft and fatty, the broth rich. Children chew cautiously, wrinkling noses but swallowing anyway. Someone passes around dried seabird. The meat smoky, salty and sharp. Another ladles out a spoonful of cod liver oil, urging the youngest to drink it for strength. They grimace, gag, but obey. Around the hearth, laughter rises. Half amusement, half relief that food still exists in the dead of winter. The fringe detail. Some folklore suggests even stranger dishes. Seal meat boiled until tender, whale blubber eaten raw in emergencies, and even horse meat consumed in ritual feasts despite Christian outrage. To outsiders, these meals were barbaric. To Vikings, they were resourceful. Proof that nothing was off the table if it kept a household alive. Waste was luxury, survival was law. And yet, these oddities carried cultural flavour too. In Iceland today, sheep's head and fermented shark are still eaten at festivals, not because they're practical anymore, but because they connect people to their ancestors. Imagine Vikings laughing over a sheep's head feast, daring each other to eat the eyeball, creating memories that lasted long after hunger faded. What seems grotesque now may have been moments of humour, even bonding then. So as you poke at your imaginary plate of seabird stew, the smoke clinging to your fingers, you realise Viking cuisine wasn't a neat menu of bread, meat and ale. It was a patchwork of necessity, creativity and sheer stubbornness. Sheepheads, fish livers, puffins, all of it fit into the same story. When the world outside froze, you ate what you had, and sometimes what you had was stranger than comfort. The sheep's head stew simmers down to bones, the cod liver oil leaves its slick aftertaste, and you sit back by the fire, belly both full and unsettled. But while we've toured through breads, meats, fish, and quirky delicacies, there's still a question that nags scholars even today. What really dominated the Viking diet? Was it meat and dairy from their farms, or fish pulled endlessly from sea and river? Tonight the hall hums with debate, not among warriors, but among archaeologists, historians, and curious minds trying to piece together the puzzle from scraps of bone and seed. Here's the case for fish. Archaeological digs in coastal settlements like Hythabu and Trondheim have uncovered mountains of fish bones, evidence of large-scale drying and export of cod and herring. Stockfish wasn't just food, it was currency traded across Europe, feeding markets far from Norway's shores. Imagine racks of cod stretching for miles along the coast, a harvest of silver-scaled abundance. For families living by the sea, fish was constant, reliable, and calorie-rich. You could smoke it, dry it, ferment it. It filled boats, bellies, and purses. But inland, the story shifts. Excavations of farmsteads show bones from cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats dominating the trash heaps. Add to that charred grains of barley, rye, and oats, and the picture looks more like a diet centred on porridge, bread, and dairy. For farmers far from the coast, meat and milk from their own animals were safer bets than hauling barrels of fish across mountain passes. Picture a snowy valley where rivers freeze and boats can't pass. There you'd cling to the cows in the byre and the bread in the pantry. The quirky detail, pollen analysis and residue testing from cooking pots reveal both fish oils and milk fats clinging stubbornly to clay, sometimes in the same pot. That suggests meals weren't strictly one thing or the other. They were layered, mixed, pragmatic. A stew of barley could be flavoured with both a hunk of dried fish and a splash of milk. Vikings weren't strict about categories. Food was food. Scholars argue fiercely over which side of this spectrum was more typical. Some suggest coastal Norse were practically pescatarian, living on fish and supplementing with grains when they could. Others argue the sagas, with their constant references to cattle, sheep and boars, reflect a diet more centred on livestock. The debate is fuelled partly by bias. Medieval chroniclers often mocked Vikings as fish eaters, a slur implying poverty or primitiveness. Did this exaggerate their reliance on the sea, or was it actually accurate? The jury is still out. Picture the longhouse as a microcosm of this debate. One family sits down to a dinner of fish stew, the smell of cod heavy in the air, bread dipped into the broth. Across the fjord, another family eats porridge thick with goat's milk and a scrap of pork. Both meals are Viking, both are survival, but ask a saga poet which deserves to be sung about, and that they'll pick the roast boar every time. Fish didn't make good poetry, and here lies the heart of the puzzle. Status shaped perception. Meat was glamorous, heroic, worthy of feasts and oaths. Fish was practical, everyday, the stuff of workers and children. Archaeology shows us fish bones in heaps. Sagas show us meat at feasts. Which one defined the diet? Probably both, but in different ways. One fed the body, the other fed the story. The fringe idea? Some historians suggest Vikings might have leaned more heavily on fish than we think precisely, because sagas downplayed it. Fish kept the population alive, but meat was the cultural ideal. It's a little like modern people posting steak dinners on Instagram while living mostly on pasta at home. The sagas are highlight reels, not grocery lists. So as you sit by the hearth, imagining one household chewing through Stockfish while another savours goat stew, you realise the truth doesn't have to be either or. The Viking diet was as varied as the landscape itself. Fish on the coast, meat inland, grain everywhere, dairy wherever animals grazed. Survival wasn't uniform, and neither was taste. And maybe that's why scholars still argue, because the Vikings themselves lived on both sides of the spectrum, adapting to whatever the land, sea, and season allowed. The fire flickers low, casting shadows across the beams, and the talk in the longhouse drifts toward weather, the endless, unpredictable partner in Viking survival. For while smoked fish, porridge, and dairy filled bellies, all of it hinged on the whims of the climate. Tonight, you can almost hear the wind shift outside, a reminder that one poor harvest, one large storm, could unravel months of careful planning. Food wasn't just about storage and skill, it was about gambling against nature itself. In the Viking Age, the North Atlantic climate was relatively mild compared to later centuries, but even then, the growing season was painfully short. Barley and rye had to sprout, ripen, and be harvested in a window that left no room for error. Imagine a farmer staring at the sky, praying the rains would come but not too much, that frost would hold off just a few more weeks. If the grain failed, the winter pot grew thin. If the hay failed, animals starved, and the autumn slaughter became brutal. Every sunrise was a wager with the weather, and then came the darker shifts. Scholars point to the Little Ice Age, which began centuries after the classic Viking Age but may have been foreshadowed by earlier cooling periods. Crops failed more often. Sea ice thickened, and sailing routes grew treacherous. Imagine rowing into seas choked with unexpected ice flows, your dried fish stash dwindling because you couldn't reach Greenland's shore. Climate change wasn't a headline for the Vikings, it was a lived reality that quietly eroded their world. Here's the quirky detail. Some Icelandic sagas describe summers so poor that hay had to be cut from seaweed and marsh plants to feed livestock. Farmers dragged kelp from beaches, dried it and stuffed it into barns as emergency fodder. Cows chewed reluctantly, and the milk they gave tasted faintly of the sea. Imagine pouring that into your morning porridge, a bowl of barley and saltwater essence. Not ideal, but better than hunger. The debate among scholars is whether climate shifts directly triggered the decline of Viking colonies abroad like Greenland. Some argue that cooling temperatures and shorter growing seasons doomed farms there, leaving settlers too dependent on imported grain. Others counter that social and political pressures mattered more: conflict, isolation, or refusal to adapt diets more fully to the Inuit-style reliance on marine resources. Did Vikings starve because of weather, or because of stubbornness? The truth, as usual, is probably tangled in both. Picture a longhouse in Greenland. The snow piles high outside, sealing doors, the fields buried under white months longer than expected. Inside, the pantry is already thin. Bread is gone, meat is rationed, and the only relief comes from fish caught through holes in the ice. Children huddle close to the hearth, chewing slowly, while parents mutter about the old days when summers lasted longer, when cows gave more milk. You can almost feel the dread, not just hunger, but the fear that the world itself is turning against you. But not all was despair. Vikings were remarkably adaptable. Sea ice closing off one fjord meant opening another for seal hunts. Shorter summers meant harder work, planting faster, harvesting earlier. Some scholars believe they even shifted diets over time, leaning more heavily on marine mammals, seabirds, and hardy root vegetables as climates cooled. Imagine the creativity required, turning kelp into fodder, seabirds into stews, and whatever scraps the land still offered into fuel for another season. The fringe speculation? Some environmental historians argue that climate shifts may have also fueled raiding. A bad harvest at home could push restless young men to take to the seas, searching for food, wealth, or land elsewhere. In that sense, your bowl of porridge back in Norway might be tied directly to a raid on an English monastery. Hunger and opportunity tangled together in the oar's rhythm. So as you sit in the longhouse with the wind whistling at the door, you realise Viking survival wasn't only about clever storage or fierce hunting. It was about reading the skies, enduring the shifts, and making peace with the fact that sometimes, despite all planning, the land gave too little. The sagas sing of warriors, but behind those stories lie generations of farmers, sailors, and mothers staring at the clouds, hoping the world itself wouldn't starve them out. The winds still whip outside, snow piling high against the longhouse walls, but inside the true centre of Viking survival glows steady and warm: the hearth. It's easy to imagine raids and feasts, smokehouses and slaughter, but in the end, most Viking meals began and ended right here. A fire burning in the middle of a timber hall, flames licking upward through the smoke hole in the roof. Tonight, let's sit closer to the embers and watch how daily life unfolded around this blaze that was half kitchen, half lifeline. Picture the scene. The fire pit stretches down the middle of the room, lined with stones blackened from decades of use. Iron tripods hold pots above the flames, their sides crusted with soot, their contents bubbling, porridge, stew, broth, maybe a hunk of salted fish softening in the heat. A wooden ladle rests nearby, sticky from use, waiting to stir. Children crouch close, hands outstretched, warming fingers while their mother scatters herbs into the pot. Dogs sniff around the edges, tails wagging, hoping for bones. Every smell, every sound, every breath of warmth comes from this single glowing core. Cooking here wasn't quick. Bread baked slowly on flat stones near the coals, flipped with careful hands to keep from burning. Meat roasted on spits, fat dripping into the fire, hissing and popping. Stews simmered for hours, growing thicker and richer as ingredients were added bit by bit. Picture yourself dipping a spoon into the pot at different times of day. Morning barley thin as soup, evening barley thick enough to stand your spoon upright. The hearth was a clock as much as a kitchen. Here's a quirky detail. Longhouses were smoky, very smoky. With no chimney, only a roof hole, the air often hung heavy with haze, eyes watered, clothes soaked up the smell, lungs filled with soot. Yet that same smoke preserved meat hanging in the rafters, killed off pests, and kept the hall warm. Imagine living in a world where every bite of food tasted faintly of ash, where your hair smelled of smoke from cradle to grave. To Vikings, it wasn't inconvenience, it was home. Scholars debate just how much cooking was done indoors versus in outbuildings. Some argue that longhouses were too smoky and dangerous for constant cooking, so outdoor kitchens or smaller side huts may have handled much of the work in summer. Others insist the hearth remained the beating heart, especially in winter when stepping outside meant frostbite. The truth probably shifted with seasons. Outside in summer when smoke was unbearable, inside in winter when warmth was life. The hearth wasn't just kitchen, it was gathering place. Families sat around it to eat, talk, mend clothes, carve wood, share stories. Meals weren't isolated events but woven into the fabric of daily work. Picture a father sharpening a knife while chewing bread, a child stirring porridge as practice, a grandmother humming sagas while sprinkling dried herbs into a pot. Food wasn't separate from life, it was braided into every action, every chore. And here's the fringe speculation. Some historians suggest hearths had spiritual weight too. Offerings of bread or milk might be dropped directly into the fire for household spirits. Flames weren't only for cooking, they were doorways, a link between worlds. Imagine tossing in the first spoonful of stew as a gift, watching it hiss and vanish. believing the unseen had been fed alongside you. Picture a long winter night, snow howling against the walls. Inside, the family gathers, the pot bubbles steadily, filling the hall with steam and smell. A bowl is ladled out for each person, passed hand to hand. Bread is dunked, bites are chewed. Warmth spreads. Outside, the world is white and merciless. Inside, the fire is red and steady. It's not a feast, not a saga, just survival. But in its simplicity lies comfort. The fire burns, the food cooks, and for one more night, the family is fed. So as you settle near the hearth, listening to the crackle, watching sparks float upward into the dark rafters, you realise this was the true heart of Viking food culture. Not the feasts of kings, not the exotic spices of trade, but the everyday meals built on fire, patience, and family. Every story of bread, fish, meat, and dairy circles back to this pit of glowing embers. Without it, there is no survival, no comfort, no sagas to tell. The hearth burns low, the embers soft and steady, and you lean back against the timber wall with a belly warmed by barley and fish. But as the night stretches on, your mind drifts far beyond this smoky longhouse. What happens when we trace Viking food forward in time, past the sagas, past the raids, past the winters survived? What echoes of their meals linger in Scandinavia today, hidden in the bread, the fish, the dairy that still fills northern tables? The journey doesn't end in the 9th century. It lingers every time someone bites into a dish that carries Viking fingerprints. Start with bread. The fat barley and rye loaves of Viking life might not look glamorous, but echoes survive in crisp bread still popular across Scandinavia. Dry, thin, and able to last for months in storage. Picture a modern kitchen in Oslo, a plate of rye crisp bread topped with butter and cheese. Strip away the electric oven, and you've got something astonishingly close to what a Viking family ate by the hearth. The crunch bridges 1,000 years. Then there's fish. Stockfish. Those stiff, dried cod hung in icy winds, is still produced in northern Norway, still exported worldwide, and still cooked in dishes that trace their lineage back to Viking smoke racks. In Italy, of all places, stockfish became a beloved import, transformed into stews and casseroles. Imagine a Viking trader leaning on a barrel of dried cod, unaware that centuries later, Italians would be eating it on Christmas Eve. The ocean harvest never stopped shaping northern cuisine. It just spread its influence across continents. Dairy, too, remained central. Skyr, once a Viking staple, is now marketed as a protein-rich superfood in grocery stores far beyond Iceland. The tangy spoonfuls that once kept children alive through January now fill plastic tubs in gyms and health stores. Picture a Viking mother handing her child a clay bowl of skyr by the fire, and then picture a 21st century jogger eating the same thing with strawberries on top. History doesn't just repeat, it repackages with better branding. The quirky detail? Blood sausages, those dense, iron-rich Viking creations, still exist in Scandinavian kitchens, though with more seasoning and less ritual than before. In Iceland, blodmør, blood pudding, is eaten during traditional winter festivals, a direct echo of Viking thrift. And yes, sheep's head dishes, puffin, even fermented shark remain on some menus, now framed as heritage food rather than sheer necessity. What once was survival is now a connection to identity. Scholars debate how much continuity really exists. Were these modern foods passed down directly, or reinvented later with romantic nods to the past? Some argue that Viking cuisine vanished into medieval European cooking, only resurfacing through national pride centuries later. Others believe the line is unbroken. Recipes tweaked, yes, but never abandoned. Every loaf of rye bread, every block of cheese, every smoked fish is another verse in the same long saga. Picture a modern Scandinavian family gathered around a table in winter. The lights are electric, the windows double glazed, the shelves filled with plenty. Yet on the table sits rye bread, butter, smoked salmon, maybe a dish of skyr for dessert. Outside, the snow falls heavy, just as it did 1,000 years ago. Inside, the food offers the same comfort: warmth, fullness, survival. The hearth has been replaced by radiators, the smokehouse by refrigeration, but the rhythm remains. And here's the fringe speculation. Perhaps what the Vikings really left behind wasn't just recipes, but an attitude. Resourcefulness, resilience, the refusal to waste, the willingness to eat what was available, whether puffin or porridge, sheep's head or skyr. Even today, the Scandinavian concept of friluftsliv, living with nature, enduring it rather than fighting it, feels like the culinary philosophy of those smoky longhouses carried forward. So as you sit by the last glowing coals of the fire, the sagas of barley and stockfish, butter and blood pudding circling in your head, you realise the Vikings' table never truly vanished. It lingers in crisp bread crunches, in skyr's tang, in the smoke of salmon fillets, in the thrift of using every scrap. Their meals weren't just survival strategies, they were cultural seeds, planted in frozen soil and still sprouting in kitchens across the north. And though you might not gnaw on dried cod tonight, or chew through bark bread, every bite of rye, every spoonful of yogurt, every smoky taste of fish carries whispers from that longhouse fire where winter was beaten back, one meal at a time. The last coals glow faintly in the longhouse, and you ease back into the quiet, the sagas of Viking survival gently fading into the dark. After wandering through 25 chapters of bread and barley, the oak and salt, feasts and famine, so you've tasted the rhythm of their winters, sometimes harsh, sometimes inventive, sometimes surprisingly familiar. What began as a cold, desperate question, how did they endure, ends with something softer, the realization that their story isn't so different from ours. Think about it. We still worry about storing food, just with refrigerators instead of smokehouses. We still gather around tables to mark rituals, whether with roast turkey, birthday cake, or New Year's champagne. We still reach for comfort food when life feels bleak, and we still tell stories about what we eat. The Vikings were no strangers to these instincts. They just did it with rye bread instead of sourdough starters, cod instead of canned tuna, bog butter instead of margarine, and there's something comforting in that continuity. 1,000 years separate your kitchen from a smoky longhouse, but both echo with the same needs: warmth, fullness, connection. You can almost picture a Viking mother scolding her child to finish their porridge, a father carving up a roasted joint with quiet pride, a family laughing as they dared each other to eat the eyeball from a sheep's head. Swap the stew for spaghetti or the stockfish for takeout pizza, and the heartbeat is the same. As you wind down, let the images blur. Racks of cod swaying in the Arctic wind, butter churns thudding rhythmically, feasts roaring with mead and laughter, quiet bowls of porridge eaten in silence. These weren't just meals, they were survival stitched together day by day, flavour by flavour, and against the endless dark of northern winters, they were also hope, the belief that spring would return, that the fire would hold, that tomorrow there would still be something to eat. So close your eyes now. Let the hearth smoke drift into memory, and carry with you the strange, resilient poetry of Viking food. May it remind you that survival can be gritty, resourceful, and even a little quirky, but it's always a story worth telling. Sweet dreams, and may your table, whatever's on it, be full, warm, and shared.